The room went dead quiet when Captain Logan Pierce, one of the most decorated snipers in Iron Vale's elite combat unit, stood up in the middle of a recovery briefing and pointed at the nurse in the corner. "With all due respect," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "what exactly makes her qualified to tell any of us how to recover from combat?" Evelyn Hart didn't flinch. She set down her clipboard, looked at him the way someone looks at a wound they've seen 100 times before, and said, "You count kills, Captain. I count the ones who made it home." Nobody laughed. Not yet. But they would. And then they'd wish they hadn't. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to my channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The briefing room at Iron Vale Defense Medical Center smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. The kind of institutional smell that never quite leaves a building, no matter how many times you repaint the walls. 12 chairs arranged in 2 rows. A whiteboard with half-erased injury diagrams. A projector casting pale blue light across faces that had seen things most people would never understand. Captain Logan Pierce sat in the front row, which wasn't assigned seating. He just always ended up there. 29 years old, lean in the way that came from discipline rather than genetics, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed specifically to hold a sniper's cheek weld. His service record read like fiction. 4 deployments, 93 confirmed engagements at ranges that defied what most people believed a human being was capable of. He had been profiled in 2 military publications. His unit called him the calculator, because he didn't just shoot, he computed. Distance, wind, elevation, target behavior patterns. Everything reduced to variables he could control. He was not, by most assessments, a difficult person, but he had a problem with things he considered imprecise, vague things, unmeasurable things, people who couldn't explain exactly what they did and why it worked. Evelyn Hart was, in his estimation, exactly that kind of person. She stood at the back of the room near the supply cart. Not quite part of the presentation, not quite separate from it either. Mid-50s, gray threading through dark hair that she kept pulled back without ceremony. Her scrubs were standard issue blue, the same as any other nurse on the floor. She had no rank insignia, no service patches, nothing that differentiated her from the civilian contract staff who rotated through Iron Vale every few months. She'd been consulting on the tactical recovery program for the past 3 weeks, which Logan had noticed primarily because her recommendations kept appearing in his unit's post-op protocols without anyone really explaining who had approved them. He didn't have a problem with her personally. He had a problem with the fact that her methods didn't come with documentation he could verify. The briefing that morning was a standard recovery evaluation following Operation Threadneedle, a surveillance extraction that had gone sideways in the 3rd phase, leaving 4 members of Logan's unit with injuries ranging from a ruptured eardrum to a fractured femur sustained during an emergency descent. The unit's primary physician, Colonel Dara Weston, had authorized Evelyn to present a modified recovery timeline that pushed 2 soldiers back to limited active duty faster than the standard protocol allowed. It was the modified timeline that set Logan off. "I'm looking at this," he said, tapping the printout on his knee, "and I'm not seeing the clinical basis for moving Reyes back to field-capable status in 11 days. Standard protocol for his injury classification is 17. What's the reasoning?" Evelyn looked up from the supply cart. "The reasoning is that Reyes's baseline physical conditioning and his injury response pattern suggest he'll plateau on passive recovery by day 9. Keeping him sedentary past that point actually delays his return to functional strength. That's experiential judgment, not clinical data." "Yes," Evelyn said simply. "It is." Logan set the printout on the empty chair beside him. "With all due respect, I'm not comfortable with my soldiers' recovery being managed on the basis of someone's gut feeling." A few heads turned. Sergeant Delia Okonkwo, seated 3 chairs down, exhaled slowly through her nose. The particular exhale that meant she was deciding whether this was worth getting involved in. She decided against it, at least for now. Evelyn crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was settling in. "It's not a gut feeling, it's pattern recognition developed over a significant number of patient cases. The difference is that I can't hand you a citation for it." "Then I'd like to understand your qualifications for making that call." The room shifted. It wasn't that the question was out of line, Technically, it wasn't. Technically, it was exactly the right kind of question to ask about someone altering a medical protocol. The problem was the way Logan asked it, the flatness of it, the implication underneath. Colonel Weston, who had been standing near the projector and would later say she should have intervened earlier, said carefully, "Evelyn has been working in trauma care for over 30 years. Her consultation record here has been—" "I've been asking her," Logan said. It was a rude cut. He knew it when he made it, and he made it anyway, which told Delia everything she needed to know about where Logan's head was that morning. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Not angry, not flustered, just looking at him. Then she said, "You measure battles by distance. I measure them by the lives that come home." It wasn't a mic drop. It wasn't delivered with drama. She said it the way you'd state a preference for how you took your coffee. But something in the room contracted, like the air pressure had dropped 2 degrees. Logan held her gaze. "That's a meaningful sentiment. It doesn't tell me why Reyes should be cleared in 11 days instead of 17, Weston said, firmly this time. "Captain, we can revisit the timeline in a separate session. For now—" "I think we should revisit it now." Logan stood up, which he hadn't quite planned to do. It was reflex, the same physical instinct that moved him when a situation required presence. "Because I've read every consultant profile in this program, and I cannot find hers. I cannot find published research. I cannot find institutional affiliations beyond this contract, and I cannot find any explanation for how she got advisory authority over my unit's medical protocols." The room was fully, completely silent now. Evelyn had not moved from the supply cart. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her posture had, a stillness that was different from before, less like patience and more like something held. "You want to know my qualifications," she said. "Yes." "I'll summarize them," Evelyn said. 31 years in trauma care, 14 of those in direct field application. I have treated penetrating ballistic injuries, blast trauma, crush syndrome, compartment syndrome in the field without surgical support, hemothorax drainage under fire, and emergency airway management in conditions that most of this room's physicians have never encountered outside of a simulation. I don't have published research because the work I did wasn't the kind that gets published. The pause that followed was half a second, and Logan filled it immediately. "Wasn't the kind that gets published," he repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means it was classified." Logan looked at Weston. Weston looked at the projector screen. That was answer enough. But Logan wasn't satisfied. He had the particular problem of being a person who needed things to be complete, and a classified background was not a complete answer. It was a wall around an answer, and walls bothered him. "I'm sure your experience is real," he said, in a tone that contained almost none of the respect that the words suggested. "But I would feel better about my soldiers being managed under your recommendations if we had something more concrete. That's not disrespect. That's due diligence." Several things happened in the next 15 seconds that would later be dissected at length by everyone in that room. Sergeant Okonkwo said, "Logan," just the name. The tone said, "Stop." Evelyn said, "Due diligence is a fair ask, Captain." She said it without edge, without heat, and then she picked up her clipboard and walked toward the door, pausing only to tell Weston, "I'll have a written summary of the clinical rationale for the Reyes timeline on your desk by 1400. She left. The room sat with the residue of what had just happened for 3 full seconds before anyone spoke. "Well," said Corporal Adi Satan, who was 22 and had not yet learned that some silences should be left alone. That was awkward. Logan did not feel good about it by noon. He wasn't the type to second-guess himself on tactical decisions, but interpersonal friction was different. Interpersonal friction was inefficient, and inefficiency bothered him almost as much as imprecision. He spent 40 minutes in the gym running through the exchange in his head and concluded that he had been correct on the substance and perhaps less careful than he should have been on the delivery. He made a note to ask Weston for Evelyn's background documentation through proper channels. That was the correct approach. That was how you got information you needed without making a scene. Weston, however, found him first. She came to the gym at 12:45, which meant she'd walked past 2 floors and a checkpoint to reach him, which meant she was not happy. "What you did in there," she said from the doorway, arms crossed, "was not a good look for your unit." I asked reasonable questions. "You did it in a way that was designed to undermine her in front of an audience." Logan stepped off the treadmill. wiped his face with a towel. That wasn't my intent. Intent and impact are different things. You know that. Is there a formal issue? Weston exhaled. No, but I want you to know that Evelyn Hart's consulting contract was approved at a level above mine, which means if you want to challenge her advisory authority, you'd need to take that up with the installation commander, not run it through a briefing room performance. Logan filed that information. Who approved the contract? Colonel Harlan Voss, and he approved it on recommendation from Regional Medical Command. Logan didn't know Voss well. The installation commander was the kind of officer who existed at the level above routine operations, the kind you briefed occasionally and otherwise navigated around. The fact that Evelyn's contract had come through Voss suggested there was institutional weight behind her that Logan hadn't accounted for. He considered this for a moment. Then he said, "I'll talk to Voss." Weston's expression shifted into something that might have been the beginnings of regret. Not quite a wince, but in that neighborhood. "Logan, I would strongly advise against, I'll be professional about it." She left looking the way people look when they know a thing is going to happen, and they've already decided they're not going to watch. The meeting with Voss did not go the way Logan intended. He framed it carefully. He presented his concerns about protocol verification, about the importance of clinical documentation in recovery management for high-value military personnel, about the institutional responsibility to ensure advisory staff met the same standards as accredited clinical staff. He was measured. He was professional. He made his case in 4 minutes without once using a tone that could be characterized as anything other than appropriate. Voss listened to all of it. Then he leaned back in his chair, looked at Logan the way an older officer sometimes looks at a younger one who has no idea what room they've just walked into, and said, "Are you finished?" "Yes, sir." "You're raising concerns about Evelyn Hart's qualifications." "I am." "Based on your assessment of her briefing this morning?" "Yes, sir." Voss folded his hands on the desk. He had a particular quality of stillness that senior officers sometimes developed, the kind that came from having spent decades deciding how much to say and when. "Captain, I'm going to tell you one thing, and I want you to hear it clearly. Evelyn Hart's file is above your access level. I'm not going to tell you what's in it. What I will tell you is that her advisory role here was not an administrative accident, and it was not a favor. Are we clear?" Logan said, "Yes, sir." "Good. Is there anything else?" There was nothing else. What happened next was not what Logan expected, and not what Voss intended, and certainly not what anyone in the tactical recovery program had planned for. Colonel Harlan Voss, 40 minutes after Logan left his office, made a phone call to Regional Medical Command to flag the internal friction around Evelyn Hart's position. His intent was protective. He wanted to make sure the contract was insulated from what he characterized as unit friction driven by one officer's ego. He said this phrase with the comfortable authority of a man who believed he was managing a minor problem. Regional Medical Command, upon hearing that Evelyn Hart's position had become a visibility issue at Iron Vale, made the bureaucratic decision that visibility issues were managed by reduction. They called Voss back 90 minutes later and told him to place Evelyn Hart's consulting role on administrative hold pending a routine review. Voss, to his credit, argued. He lost. Evelyn received the notification at 16:30, in the form of a printed memo slid under the door of the small office she'd been assigned near the East Wing Recovery Bay. She was still in the middle of reviewing the Reyes timeline documentation when she picked it up and read it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk, finished the sentence she'd been writing, and closed the folder. She did not immediately react in any visible way that anyone else could observe, because no one else was in the room. But she sat very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, that was the specific effort of not letting something show that wanted to. 31 years, 14 of them in places that don't appear on maps. Soldiers she'd kept alive with 2 hands, inadequate supplies, and the specific kind of knowledge that only comes from watching people die and learning from every single one of them. And it had taken one young officer with a spotless record and a talent for long-range shots approximately 4 hours to unravel her position here. She had known, when she'd taken the contract, that the institutional structure at Iron Vale was not designed for people like her. She was used to being the person in the room that nobody had a clean category for. She was used to having to justify her presence in spaces that hadn't been built with her in mind. That didn't make it easier. It just meant she knew how to keep her hand steady while she packed up her materials. She was carrying the last box to the East Wing exit when Delia Okonkwo fell in beside her. Delia had a quality that some people mistook for bluntness, but was actually something closer to directness paired with extreme situational awareness. She had served in 3 conflict zones, held a position record for close quarters target clearance, and was one of 4 people in Logan's unit who had the particular experience of having been shot at from multiple directions simultaneously and made sound tactical decisions throughout. She was also, as it happened, the only person in that briefing room who had looked at Evelyn's hands during Logan's confrontation rather than at either of their faces. Evelyn's hands had not moved, had not gripped the cart, had not shifted, had not done any of the micro-reactive things that hands do when a person is rattled. Delia had cataloged this and filed it. "You don't have to explain," Delia said, walking beside her. "I just wanted to say, what happened in there wasn't right." "It happens," Evelyn said. "That doesn't make it right." "No, it doesn't." They walked in silence for a few paces. "Reyes," Delia said, "your timeline for him, 11 days. You're correct, aren't you?" Evelyn glanced at her. "I'm confident in it. I've been watching him in PT. He's been compensating on the left side since day 3. His body is already doing what you predicted." Delia paused. "I'll document it, formally. Put my name on it." Evelyn stopped walking, looked at Delia directly. "Why?" Delia shrugged, which on her looked more like a strategic adjustment of posture. "Because I know what it looks like when someone knows what they're doing, and I know what it looks like when the wrong person gets listened to." She nodded at the box in Evelyn's arms. "That shouldn't be happening." Evelyn held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Sergeant." "Don't thank me. Just be available when they realize they made a mistake." She didn't expect them to realize it this fast. The call came at 22:17. Evelyn was in her quarters in the civilian contractor housing unit on the south side of Ironvale, a functional room with a cot and a window that faced the motor pool, when her phone rang with a number she recognized as the installation's emergency medical line. She picked up before the second ring. "This is Hart." The voice on the other end was Weston's, and it had lost all of its earlier precision. "Evelyn, we have a situation. Convoy 7 Bravo was hit 40 minutes ago during a classified extraction in the Dunmore Valley corridor. We've got incoming, 4 critical, 2 urgent, personnel unknown until they're on the ground. ETA 12 minutes. Evelyn was already standing. "Mechanism of injury? IED primary, secondary small arms. We're expecting blast trauma, possible crush injuries from vehicle impact, penetrating wounds. What's your surgical coverage?" Brannick is the on-call trauma surgeon, but he's already in the OR with an aortic repair. We have residents. Evelyn said, "I'll be there in 4 minutes. You're on administrative hold. Do you want me there or not?" A 2-second pause. "We want you there." She was out the door in 45 seconds. The trauma bay at Ironvale was not a combat hospital. That was the problem. It was a facility designed for a population of military personnel who were by and large located on a functioning installation, not arriving from an active engagement zone. It had surgical capability, good diagnostic equipment, and staff that were competent within the normal scope of their work. What it was not designed for was mass casualty intake from a combat operation, the kind of scenario that required triage logic that was different from standard ER prioritization. The kind that required someone who understood not just the injuries, but the specific pathology of how people broke in those particular circumstances. The residents on duty were good. They were working hard. They were also visibly over their depth in a way that Weston, when Evelyn arrived and read the room in approximately 6 seconds, acknowledged with a single look. "Tell me what you've got," Evelyn said, pulling on gloves. Weston ran it. "First transport just radioed in. 3 patients. 2 from the vehicle, 1 extracted from a secondary position. Second transport behind by 8 minutes with additional 2. What do we know about the vehicle patients? Blast primary. Both conscious on extraction. Conscious now doesn't mean stable. Blast lung can present delayed. We need auscultation and O2 monitoring on both the moment they come through the door, not after we assess the obvious injuries." She was already moving to the supply rack, pulling equipment with the particular efficiency of someone who wasn't thinking about where things were because she already knew. Who's your most experienced resident? Calloway, 3rd year. Put Calloway on airway. Who else? Weston pointed. Evelyn assessed the 2 younger residents in 30 seconds of observation. Their hands, their posture, the way they were standing relative to the bay entrance, all of it information, and assigned them positions. By the time the first transport arrived, the trauma bay had reorganized. Logan Pierce was not supposed to be there. He had been in the gym when the emergency alert went out, which meant he was physically close enough to the trauma wing that he'd followed the movement of staff on instinct, the way soldiers sometimes move toward commotion before they've consciously decided to. He was standing in the corridor outside the trauma bay doors when the first gurney came through. He saw the soldier on it and recognized him. Corporal Adisatan, who that same morning had said, "That was awkward," into a silence that Logan had created, was now pale and barely conscious, left arm wrapped in a field dressing that had soaked through, jaw set against pain he was clearly working very hard not to show. Logan went very still. Then he heard Evelyn's voice from inside the bay, calm and exact, directing Calloway to the specific assessment sequence for blast primary patients. He heard her call out 2 warning signs to watch for that weren't in the standard intake protocol. He heard the particular quality of her voice. Not loud, not dramatic, just completely functionally sure of every word. He stood in the corridor for a long time. The second transport arrived 7 minutes later. The 2 additional patients came through, and with them came something that no one had anticipated. A figure in a uniform that Logan didn't immediately recognize, striding through the bay corridor with the bearing of someone who had clearance to be absolutely anywhere, flanked by 2 personnel who were clearly not medical staff. One of them was carrying a document case. The figure stopped when he saw Evelyn at the center of the trauma bay, sleeves rolled, directing care with the focused intensity of someone running an operation. He watched her for a moment with an expression that Logan, from his position in the corridor, couldn't fully read, but it contained something that looked from a distance less like surprise than like confirmation. He said something to one of the personnel beside him. The personnel opened the document case. Logan didn't know what was in it yet, but he watched the figure's face, and he watched Evelyn's hands on the patient in front of her, and something in his chest shifted with the specific discomfort of a man beginning to understand the shape of what he'd done. The document case closed. The figure turned to the corridor, caught Logan's eyes, and held them for just a moment. Then he turned toward Voss's office. Whatever was in that case, it had not come from Regional Medical Command, and it had not been brought here by accident. Somewhere behind the closed bay doors, Evelyn Hart kept working. The document case was a standard military-issue hard shell, the kind with foam padding cut to hold specific contents rather than just transport loose materials. Logan had seen enough of them to know that the precise cutouts inside weren't for administrative paperwork. That kind of case carried records that had physical classification requirements. The kind that couldn't be emailed, couldn't be scanned, couldn't exist in any networked system that a determined person might eventually reach. He stood in the corridor for another 30 seconds after the figure disappeared toward Voss's office. Then he did the thing that was probably not the correct tactical decision, but was the only one available to him. He followed, not close, not obvious. He moved the way he'd been trained to move in confined spaces. Measured pace, natural purpose, the body language of someone who was going somewhere rather than following someone. The figure's 2 companions had posted outside Voss's door by the time Logan reached the corner, which told him the meeting was the kind that didn't want witnesses. He stopped at the water fountain 12 feet from the door and drank for longer than he needed to. He could hear voices, but not words. The tone through the door was the tone of a conversation with existing weight. Not an introduction, not a briefing from scratch. These were people who already knew each other, which meant whoever the figure was, his connection to Iron Vale predated tonight. One of the door guards noticed Logan at the fountain and held his gaze with the flat professional attention of someone whose entire job was to notice people lingering. Logan finished drinking, straightened, and walked back the way he'd come. He needed a different approach. Delia Okonkwo was in the family waiting room adjacent to the trauma bay set. Not waiting for anyone specifically, just present in the way soldiers sometimes were during a unit emergency, a gravitational pull toward the location where your people were. She was the only one in the room, sitting in a plastic chair with her elbows on her knees. and she looked up when Logan came in. "Tan?" he said. "Stable. Calloway said the arm is bad but salvageable. No blast lung." She watched him sit down across from her. "You look like you're working something out." "There's someone here. Senior officer, unknown to me, brought a classified document case to Voss's office 20 minutes ago. Came in with the second transport." Delia was quiet for a moment. "Unknown to you or unknown to the installation?" "Unknown to me, which isn't the same thing." "No," she agreed. "His uniform had no name tape, which is not technically unusual for certain roles, but paired with the document case and the timing. You think it's about her?" Logan didn't answer, which was its own answer. Delia leaned back in the chair. "I've been thinking about something since this afternoon. When Evelyn walked out of that briefing, you noticed she didn't argue." "I noticed. People who are insecure about their credentials argue. They defend themselves. She didn't." Delia picked at a thread on her sleeve. "She just answered exactly what you asked and left. That's not the behavior of someone who feels like they have something to prove." Logan said nothing. I was running the morning back through in his head, which he'd been doing, if he was honest, since approximately the moment he'd watched Evelyn reorganize the trauma bay staff in 6 seconds flat and started directing clinical care in a way that made the residents look like they'd been waiting for exactly that voice. "I made it difficult for her," he said. Not as an admission, exactly. More like a statement of fact that he was ready to stop avoiding. Delia looked at him steadily. "Yes, you did. If there's more to her background than she disclosed, then she was required to disclose," Delia corrected. "Those are different things." The waiting room door opened and Weston leaned in, still in her trauma bay scrubs, her hair escaping from the bun she'd pinned at the start of the evening. She looked at them both. "She's finishing the second patient. I need someone to tell me what's happening down the hall, because I have uniformed personnel outside my commander's office, and nobody is explaining anything to me." Logan stood. "I don't know yet." "That's not helpful." "I know." Weston pressed her fingers to her forehead briefly, the gesture of someone managing a headache they didn't have time to acknowledge. "The 4 from the convoy, 2 are going to be fine, 10 you know about. The 4th, she hesitated. "The 4th is the one Evelyn is still with. He's the one from the secondary extraction position. His name is being withheld pending notification." Logan's attention sharpened. Secondary extraction. He wasn't in the convoy. He was in a separate position in the valley, extracted by the same team. We don't have his unit assignment. Logan and Delia exchanged a glance that carried a full conversation in about a quarter of a second. "What are his injuries?" Logan asked. "Blast trauma, penetrating wound to the left thorax, and..." Weston stopped. "An old scarring that Evelyn apparently recognized. She asked me to clear the bay when she started assessing him. Just her and Calloway." The silence in the waiting room lasted about 4 seconds. "She knows him," Delia said. "That would be my read," Weston said. "What's he?" Inside the trauma bay, with the overhead lights reduced to the specific warmth that somehow made everything look slightly less clinical, Evelyn Hart was doing something she hadn't done in 11 years, which was work on a patient whose face she knew. His name was Marcus Well. He was 53 years old, which was too old for the position he'd apparently still been occupying somewhere in the Dunmore Valley, and he had a beard he hadn't had the last time she'd seen him, and he had a gunshot wound to the left thorax that had narrowly, and she meant narrowly in the specific sense of millimeters, missed his heart. He was conscious. He shouldn't have been, but Marcus Well had never done things in the order that medicine expected. "You're supposed to be in Bethesda," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was the first thing that came out of her mouth that wasn't a clinical instruction. "Change of plans," he said, and his voice was rough with pain but still recognizably his. That particular flat quality, like all the expressiveness, had been worn smooth by years of saying as little as possible. "Good to see you too. Don't talk. I need to tell you something. After I've addressed the bleed, you can tell me anything you want." She was pressing gauze against the wound with her left hand and monitoring his oxygen saturation with her right eye on the equipment and her peripheral attention on Calloway, who was doing well, but who she was also ready to redirect in an instant. "Calloway, I need you to increase the drip rate, slowly." "Yes, ma'am." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he was looking at the ceiling. "They suspended your contract. I'm aware." I heard on the way in, from the transport team. He exhaled carefully, the specific careful exhale of someone managing how much pressure their chest cavity was under. Evelyn. Marcus. I brought the file. She went still for exactly 1 second. Then her hands kept moving. You came here with a classified personnel file in the middle of a combat evacuation. I came here because I had intel that the convoy was going to get hit, and I was trying to get ahead of it, and the file was already in my possession because I've been fighting with RMC for 6 months trying to get it unsealed. His jaw tightened against something, pain, probably, or effort, or both. When I heard what they did with your contract today, I made a different decision about the timing. Evelyn looked at him, actually looked at him, past the clinical assessment, into the space where she knew his face. You got yourself extracted into a combat evacuation to deliver a personnel file. I got myself extracted because the alternative was staying in a valley with 4 armed individuals who were very interested in my location. The file was incidental. That is the worst definition of incidental I have ever heard. You've heard worse. She had. She didn't say so. What's in it? She asked. Everything, Marcus said. All of it. Kandahar. The Morale operation. The 7-strand valley work. After-action reports with your name on them that RMC has been classifying as standard operational documentation for 15 years. He breathed. Your name has been on reports that other people got commendations for. You know that, right? Evelyn said nothing. Evelyn. I knew there were questions about attribution. I didn't know the specifics. Well, he shifted slightly and she put a firm hand on his shoulder to stop him. Now you're going to. Logan found out about Marcus well the way he found out about most things he wasn't supposed to know, which was through Delia, who had a talent for being in the right proximity to the right conversations without technically eavesdropping on any of them. She came back to the waiting room at 01:15 with 2 cups of the facility's particular brand of terrible coffee and the expression of someone carrying information they were actively deciding how to distribute. The 4th patient, she said, handing Logan one of the cups. His name is Marcus Well. I got that from one of the transport team. Former special operations, currently working in some capacity I can't identify, which means the capacity is probably one of the ones that doesn't get names. Logan took the coffee. You think he knows Evelyn? I think she cleared the bay when they brought him in, and I think that's not something she would do for a random patient. Logan turned the cup in his hands. Weston said he had old scarring, the kind that suggested prior significant trauma. Right. If he worked in the kind of role that doesn't get names, and if Evelyn worked in classified field applications for 14 years, Logan stopped, worked it through. They were in the same program. Delia was quiet. That's what's in the document case, Logan said. It wasn't a question. He was building the shape of it out loud, the way he constructed a shot calculation, starting from what he could observe and working backward to the origin point. Well brought documentation of her service record, the classified portions, and he brought it here, tonight, specifically because… He stopped again. Something cold moved through him. Because he heard about the contract suspension, he said. Delia nodded slowly. That's my read. Logan set the coffee down on the plastic side table. He'd built the calculation now. He could see it clearly. Evelyn Hart had spent 14 years doing classified field medical work. Her records had been sealed. The institutional framework she'd worked within had, for reasons that weren't clear yet, kept those records unavailable to anyone who might try to evaluate her credentials through normal channels. Today, one junior officer, him, had publicly challenged her qualifications in a briefing room, which had generated enough visibility to trigger an administrative hold through Regional Medical Command, which had stripped her of her position. And within hours, a person who apparently had enough standing to carry her classified file through a combat evacuation had arrived at Ironvale and walked directly to the installation commander's office. Logan was, technically, the reason all of this had accelerated. He was not comfortable with that. I need to know what's in that file, he said. You won't get access. I know. He stood. But Voss will have access after tonight, and Voss is going to have a decision to make. The meeting in Voss's office ended at 02:40, which Logan knew because he was still in the corridor, different section, better cover, not obviously surveillance, when the door opened and the figure emerged. In the better light of the hallway, Logan could see the rank insignia he'd missed in the trauma bay corridor. Brigadier General. 1 star. The general didn't look at Logan. He walked past with the particular forward-facing attention of someone who either hadn't noticed him or had noticed him and categorized him as irrelevant. The two companions fell in on either side. Voss appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. He looked tired in a specific way, not the tired of a long night, the tired of a man who had just been given information that reorganized something he thought he understood. He spotted Logan immediately, which meant Logan's position in the corridor hadn't been as subtle as he'd believed. "Captain," Voss said, "my office." Logan went. Voss closed the door, sat behind his desk. Did not invite Logan to sit, which Logan noted. He stood in front of the desk with his hands behind his back and waited. "What do you know?" Voss asked. "Less than you, sir. More than I did this morning." Voss considered this. The man who came in with the convoy is a retired Tier 1 operator who has been working for the past 4 years as a consultant to the Defense Intelligence Oversight Body. His name is Marcus Well. He and Evelyn Hart served in the same classified medical support unit for 9 years, operating in conflict zones that don't appear in any public operational record. Voss folded his hands. The file he brought contains after-action reports covering 16 separate operations across 3 theaters. In 14 of those reports, Evelyn Hart is credited with primary field medical decisions that saved between 2 and 7 lives per operation. Logan said nothing. The commendations associated with those operations, Voss continued, and his voice had developed a flatness that was either discipline or anger, Logan couldn't tell which, were processed under the unit commander's name. Standard practice for classified units, apparently. What is not standard practice is that when the unit was disbanded and its members transitioned to civilian or other military roles, Hart's personnel file was reconstructed from the classified version into an administrative profile that reflected only her post-service nursing credentials. Voss paused. Someone removed the active service documentation from her accessible file. The room was very quiet. "Removed," Logan said. "Removed. Not sealed. Removed." Voss looked at him. "There's a difference." Logan understood the difference. Sealed meant protected, still verifiable through proper channels. Removed meant that if you went through proper channels, you'd find nothing. "Who?" Logan said. "General Well has a theory. It's going to require an investigation that is above my authority to initiate." Voss leaned back. What I am doing, effective immediately, is restore Evelyn Hart's consulting contract, and I am personally recommending to Regional Medical Command that her role be expanded to department authority rather than consulting authority. Logan absorbed this. "Sir," he said, "my conduct in the briefing this morning was the trigger for a chain of events that we are going to say, for the purposes of any formal record, accelerated the discovery of a significant administrative error." Voss said it carefully, not generously, carefully. "However, your behavior in that briefing room was not professional, Captain, and it caused genuine harm to a person who had done nothing to deserve it. That is not going to be ignored, and I am not going to pretend it was acceptable because the outcome happened to be constructive." "No, sir. I don't expect that." "Good." Voss picked up his pen. "Get out of my office." It was 03:20 when Logan went back to the trauma bay. The activity level had dropped. The critical phase was over. Patients were stabilized. The night staff had taken over the ongoing monitoring. The bay itself had been cleaned and reset, the controlled chaos of 4 hours ago replaced by the institutional quiet of a facility that had handled what it needed to handle and was now waiting for morning. Evelyn was at the small desk in the corner of the bay, writing. Not a chart, he thought. Her posture was different. The posture of someone writing something they were choosing rather than something they were required to document. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. When she looked up, her expression didn't change exactly, but something in it acknowledged him in a way that wasn't quite welcome and wasn't quite refusal. "How's Tan?" he said. "Sleeping, genuinely, not pharmaceutically." She set her pen down. "His arm is going to need a second procedure, but he'll have full function." "And well?" A pause. "Stable. Surgery went well. He'll be fine." Logan came 2 steps into the bay, stopped. He'd been rehearsing this conversation since he'd left Voss's office, which meant he'd been overthinking it for 40 minutes, which meant what he actually said when he opened his mouth was not what he'd prepared. "I didn't know," he said. "I know that's not an excuse." Evelyn looked at him. "I made assumptions based on incomplete information, and I used a public setting to challenge you in a way that was—" He stopped, started over. "I undermined you in front of my unit, and the damage that did was not reversible by me realizing I was wrong." The overhead lights hummed. Somewhere in the bay a monitor beeped its steady interval. "No," Evelyn said. "It wasn't." She didn't say anything else. Didn't offer him an easier landing. He stood in the space of his own accountability for a moment, which was uncomfortable in the precise way it was supposed to be. "Voss is reinstating your contract," he said, "with expanded authority." "I know, he came down 30 minutes ago. There's going to be an investigation into how your service documentation was—" "I know that too." Her voice was even. "Marcus told me some version of it was going to happen eventually. The timing was—" She stopped. "Not what I expected." Logan nodded. He should leave. He'd said what he needed to say, the conversation had a natural end, and continuing past that end risked crossing into the kind of territory where he was making it about his own discomfort rather than what she actually needed. He knew this. He had reasonably good social awareness when he was thinking clearly. He stayed anyway. "You didn't defend yourself this morning," he said. "When I pushed, you answered what you were asked and you left." "Yes." "Why?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She picked up her pen, turned it in her fingers. "Because I have learned," she said, "that some rooms are not going to hear you regardless of what you say. And spending energy trying to change that is energy that isn't available for the next patient." She set the pen down again. "I've been in that briefing room before, Captain. Different building, different faces, same room." Logan said, "That's a hard way to operate." "It's an efficient one." He nodded slowly. Then he said the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the corridor, since the trauma bay, since he'd watched her move through a mass casualty situation, with the specific certainty of someone for whom emergency was simply a different kind of ordinary. "You're better at this than I understood." Evelyn looked at him for a moment, then she said, "I know." Not arrogant, not warm, just accurate. Logan left the bay and walked back toward the residential corridor, and he was halfway there when his phone buzzed with a message from Delia that read simply, "Well is asking for you, room 4. He stopped walking. Marcus Well, who had arrived tonight with a classified document case and a gunshot wound, who had apparently known Evelyn Hart for long enough to cross a combat zone to deliver her service record. Marcus Well was awake at 03:30 in the morning and asking for a junior sniper officer he had never met. Logan turned around. Whatever Marcus Well wanted to tell him, Logan had a specific and unpleasant feeling that it was going to be worse than everything he'd already learned tonight. And everything he'd already learned tonight had been considerably worse than he'd started the day prepared for. He pushed open the door to room 4. Well was propped up in the bed at the kind of angle that suggested he had done it himself rather than waiting for a nurse, which told Logan things about him before a single word was spoken. He was pale from blood loss, and he had the specific held-together quality of someone managing significant pain through conscious application of will. His eyes were sharp, though. Sharper than someone in his condition had any right to. "Sit down," Well said. His voice was worn thin but still carried the quality of a man accustomed to being listened to. "I don't have a lot of time before the painkillers make me unreliable, so I'm going to be direct." Logan sat. "You're the one who put Evelyn in the spotlight today." "Yes." "I need to know if you understand what that actually cost her." Logan held Wells' gaze. "I'm beginning to." Wells studied him for a moment, the particular study of someone evaluating whether an answer is real or performed. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied with whatever he found. "There's more to what happened to her file than a clerical error, and it didn't happen by accident." He shifted, careful, controlled. "The people who removed her documentation from the accessible record knew exactly what they were removing. They knew what her service represented, and they had specific reasons to want that service to remain invisible." He looked at Logan steadily. "She saved the right lives at the wrong time. Some of the people she pulled out of those valleys went on to testify in proceedings that were inconvenient to certain individuals. Her documentation, her after-action reports, They would have corroborated testimony that someone needed to stay uncorroborated. The room seemed to get quieter, though that wasn't physically possible. "Who?" Logan said. Wells' jaw set. "That's the investigation, and the investigation is going to go places that will make a lot of people uncomfortable." He looked at Logan with the directness of someone choosing their words, with the specific precision of a man who understood the weight of them. "Including people who are currently in positions of authority at installations not entirely unlike this one." Logan sat with that for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because you're the one who tore the cover off," Wells said. "Accidentally, incompetently, but effectively." His expression wasn't kind exactly, but it wasn't unkind either. "And because what happens next is going to need witnesses who were here from the beginning, people who watched the whole sequence." He held Logan's eyes. "You're going to be asked, at some point, what you saw tonight. I need you to see it clearly." Logan said, "What am I supposed to see?" Well turned his head toward the window. The motor pool on the south side, the dark geometry of vehicles under partial light, the early quiet of an installation before dawn. "There are 3 names in that file," he said. "Officers who signed the authorization to reclassify her documentation. One of them retired 2 years ago. One of them is currently at Regional Medical Command." He paused. "And one of them is someone you've spoken to recently." Logan's blood went cold. He knew, in the specific way that a person knows a thing they've been avoiding, exactly what Well was about to say. But Well didn't say it. His eyes had closed, the medication and the blood loss finally doing what they'd been building toward for the past hour, and his breathing evened into the rhythm of someone no longer conscious. Logan sat in the chair next to the bed of a man he'd known for 9 minutes, in a room in a building where everything he'd understood about today had been dismantled and rebuilt into something much darker than he'd started with, and he thought about the 3 names. He thought about the 2 he didn't know. He thought about the 3rd, the one he'd spoken to recently. And the list of people that description could apply to was very short. And at the top of that short list was a name that made everything else suddenly, terribly make sense. The name at the top of that short list was Colonel Harlan Voss. Logan sat with it in the dark of room 4 for a long time, listening to Marcus Well breathe, turning the shape of it over the way a person turns something sharp in their hands, carefully, looking for the angle where it stops cutting. He could not find one. The sequence fit. It fit the way a well-machined part fits, with no gap you could put a fingernail into. Voss had approved Evelyn's consulting contract, not to elevate her, to locate her. Keep her visible, keep her contained, keep her inside a structure where any inconvenient movement could be observed and managed. When Logan's confrontation in that briefing room generated institutional noise, Voss had called Regional Medical Command, and he had framed it, in his own account, as protective. But Weston had described the outcome, and the outcome was not protection. 90 minutes after Voss made a call to protect Evelyn Hart's position, Evelyn Hart's position had ceased to exist, and then Well had arrived with a document case, and by 0240 Voss was restoring her contract, recommending expanded authority, and telling Logan with careful flat gravity that someone had removed rather than sealed her documentation. Repositioning in real time. In under 3 hours, Logan stood up. His legs were stiff, which made no sense. He'd been sitting for 11 minutes. He looked at Wells' face, slack now, the sharp eyes closed. The whole held-together quality of the man finally released into the defenselessness that anesthesia and blood loss produce whether a person consents to it or not. This man crossed a threat corridor with a hole in his chest to hand-carry a file that someone spent 15 years burying. And the officer who may have signed the order to bury it just spent an hour building himself into the story as the man who fixed it. Logan walked out of room 4 and down the corridor to the nurse's station. "I need a secure line," he said. The duty nurse, a specialist named Ruiz, who was 4 hours into a shift that had already contained a mass casualty intake, looked up at him with the particular expression of a person whose patients had been fully allocated elsewhere. "Sir, it's 0347. I'm aware of the time. Is this a medical matter?" "No." Ruiz held his gaze for a moment, and something in what she saw made her decide not to push. She pointed down the hall. "Administrative office, second door. The console's unlocked. Don't leave anything on the screen." Major Iris Callahan answered on the 4th ring. Logan had her number because 6 months earlier she had debriefed his unit during the preliminary phase of Operation Threadneedle and had handed him a card at the end of it with a piece of advice attached. If you ever see something that doesn't reconcile, don't sit on it. Sitting on it is how it becomes yours. He had kept the card in the interior pocket of his jacket, in the way people keep things they hope never to need and cannot quite bring themselves to discard. Callahan. Captain Logan Pierce, Ironvale, we spoke after Threadneedle preliminary. A pause of maybe half a second, the sound of a person orienting. I remember you. It's 4 a.m. I know. I'm calling because I have a situation I don't have a framework for and I need to know the correct reporting channel before I make it worse. Go. Logan laid it out. He did it the way he did everything, which was sequentially and without embellishment. The briefing room, the administrative hold, the mass casualty intake, the arrival of a general officer with a classified document case, Voss's disclosure about the reconstructed personnel file, and Wells' statement, as close to verbatim as he could reconstruct it, about 3 signatures on a reclassification authorization. He did not say Voss's name. When he finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for Logan to hear a chair adjust on the other end. You didn't name the 3rd officer, Callahan said. I don't have confirmation. But you have an inference. I have an inference that would end a man's career if I'm wrong, and I'm not comfortable putting it into a phone call at 4 a.m. without documentation. Another pause. When Callahan spoke again, her voice had changed, not warmer, sharper. Captain, I want you to understand something about the situation you're describing. If a personnel file was reconstructed to remove classified service documentation, that is not an administrative process. That requires a coordinated authorization at multiple levels, and it leaves a signature trail specifically because the system is designed to make it leave one. Which means the people who did it either believed the trail would never be pulled or believed they'd be in a position to control who pulled it. Yes, ma'am. How many people at your installation currently know about that file? Logan ran it. The general who brought it, Colonel Voss. The patient, well, myself. Possibly Colonel Weston, who is the unit physician, but she doesn't have specifics. He hesitated. And Evelyn Hart. Where's the physical file right now? That was the question Logan had not thought to ask, and the moment Callahan said it, something in his chest dropped. I don't know, he said. Find out. Callahan's voice was flat. Captain, listen to me. The single most fragile object in this entire situation is a paper document currently sitting somewhere inside a facility where at least one person may have a 15-year interest in it, not existing. I'm going to make calls. I'm going to be moving on this within the hour. But you are on the ground and I am not, and I need you to establish where that file is and who has physical access to it. Understood. Do not confront anyone. Do not take custody of it yourself. You'll destroy the chain of evidence and hand a defense attorney a gift. Observe and report. Yes, ma'am. And Captain. A beat. The man in the bed. Well, is he stable? Post-surgical. Stable as of an hour ago. Keep an eye on him too. The line went dead. Logan sat in the dark administrative office with the console glow on his face and understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once and unpleasantly, that he had just moved from being a man who had made a bad decision in a briefing room to being a man standing in the middle of something with actual consequences attached. He wiped the console. He left the office. And he went to find Evelyn. She was not in the trauma bay. She was in the East Wing recovery corridor, in the small office that had been assigned to her 3 weeks ago and formally revoked at 16:30 the previous afternoon, and presumably informally restored at some point around 0300. The door was open. She was sitting at the desk with a folder in front of her, and she was not reading it. She was looking at it. Logan knocked on the frame anyway. Captain? Do you have the file? Evelyn looked up. Whatever exhaustion she was carrying, and she had to be carrying a considerable amount, she had been running a mass casualty intake 4 hours after being professionally dismissed. She was managing it well enough that it didn't reach her voice. No, she said. I have a summary index. Marcus gave it to me before he went under. The file itself went to Voss. Where is it now? I assume in his office. Logan came into the room and closed the door, which he registered as a slightly aggressive gesture the moment he did it, and then registered as necessary regardless. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you decide what to do with it." Evelyn set the folder down. "All right. Well, told me there are 3 signatures on the authorization that reconstructed your file." He named the general condition of each, one retired, one currently at Regional Medical Command, and one that he described as somebody I had spoken to recently. Logan kept his voice level. He went under before he said the name. Evelyn's expression did not change. That, more than anything, told him she was ahead of him. "You've already thought of it," he said. "I thought of it at 03:05, Evelyn said. "When Colonel Voss came down here and told me he was restoring my contract and recommending me for a department position, and did it with a great deal of warmth, and never once asked me a single question about the 14 years he had just apparently learned about." She looked at Logan. People who are genuinely surprised ask questions. He didn't ask any. Logan absorbed that. It was a smaller observation than the one he'd built out of Wells' statement, and it was more damning. "I called Defense Investigative Standards," he said. "Major Iris Callahan. She's moving on it within the hour." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That's a career risk for you." "Yes." "Why?" He'd expected the question and had no prepared answer that didn't sound like self-justification, so he gave her the true one instead. "Because I stood up in a room and said you weren't qualified," he said, "and I said it in a way that was designed to make everyone else agree with me. And it worked. Within 4 hours it worked so well that an institution stripped your position. That was me. That happened because of the specific way I chose to speak. That's guilt. Partly. Guilt is a poor operational motivator." Evelyn's tone wasn't unkind. It was the tone of someone stating a clinical fact. "It burns fast and it makes people do dramatic things they can't sustain." "Then here's the other part." Logan sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I watched you run that bay tonight. I've been in a lot of situations where somebody had to make fast decisions under conditions where being wrong meant somebody died. I know what it looks like when a person is performing competence, and I know what it looks like when they have it." He held her eyes. "Whoever took your record out of the system took a tool away from every unit that would have been assigned to you for 15 years. That's not an injustice to you. That's an operational loss to the entire structure, and I would like it corrected." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, "is a better reason." At 06:15, the installation woke up, and by 06:40, Colonel Harlan Voss had convened a general staff briefing in the main conference room on the 2nd floor. He opened it by describing the previous night's mass casualty response as exemplary. He named Weston, he named Callaway, he named the transport team, and then he said, with the practiced weight of a man who understood exactly how to deliver a line so it landed in the institutional memory the way he wanted it to. "And I want to specifically recognize Evelyn Hart, whose leadership in the trauma bay last night was, in my professional assessment, the single decisive factor in the survival of at least 2 of those patients. Effective immediately, Ms. Hart's role at this facility is expanded to Director of Combat Trauma Response. This is a correction of an administrative situation that should never have occurred, and I take responsibility for the delay in correcting it." The room applauded. Logan, standing at the back wall with Delia Okonkwo, did not. Delia leaned toward him without moving her head. "He's building a record." "Yes. That whole speech will be in the installation log by noon. Colonel Voss identified and corrected the administrative error." She kept her eyes forward. "You can't investigate a man for burying something after he's put himself on record as the one who unburied it. Not easily." "I know. So what do we do?" Logan watched Voss at the front of the room, accepting the applause with the appropriate degree of modesty, and thought about the question Callahan had asked him at 4 in the morning. "Where is the physical file right now?" "We find out what's in his office," Logan said. The escalation came at 09:20, and it came from an entirely different direction than anyone was watching. Marcus Wells' blood pressure dropped. It happened over the course of about 11 minutes, which in retrospect was the detail that mattered most, not the drop itself, which had a dozen possible causes in a post-thoracotomy patient, but the shape of the drop. Ruiz noticed it first, flagged it at 09:24, and Callaway came in at 09:26 and did the correct initial workup: vitals, chest tube output, breath sounds, saturation. Chest tube output had increased, not catastrophically. but it had increased. Calloway called it as a possible re-bleed at the surgical site and escalated to the on-call surgical resident, which was procedurally correct and also approximately 4 minutes slower than the situation could tolerate. Evelyn arrived at 09:31. She had been on the second floor when Ruiz paged her, and she came through the door of room 4 at a pace that was fast without being frantic, and stopped at the foot of the bed, and she did not touch the patient for the first 6 seconds. She looked at him. Then she said, "Trachea's deviating." Calloway looked up sharply. "I checked it at 09:26. It was midline." "It's not midline now." Evelyn was already moving to the left side. "Breath sounds on the left?" "Diminished, but he's post-thoracotomy. That's expected." "Diminished compared to what? To your assessment at 09:26 or to your assessment at admission?" Calloway's mouth opened and then closed, because the honest answer was that he had been comparing to expectation rather than to a documented baseline, which was the specific error that killed people in exactly this scenario. "Get me a 14 gauge, Evelyn said, "and call the OR. Tell them we have a probable tension physiology and a post-op thoracotomy, and I want a surgeon down here in under 3 minutes, not 5. "Ma'am, the chest tube is patent. If it's tension, then the tube should be... The tube is patent for fluid. It's occluded for air. That happens when a clot forms at the fenestration and the tube keeps draining blood while air accumulates above it." She held her hand out. Ruiz put the needle in it, which is exactly the presentation you're looking at. Wells' saturation dropped from 94 to 89 on the monitor, then to 86. "Blood pressure?" Evelyn said. 72/40, Ruiz said, down from 88. "Second line, wide open and pull 2 units. Calloway, I want you where you can see my hands." Evelyn found the landmark on Wells' left chest wall with 2 fingers and did not rush the identification, which was the difference between the procedure working and the procedure creating a second problem. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular. I'm going over the top of the 3rd rib, not under the 2nd. The neurovascular bundle runs inferior." She inserted the needle. There was a sound, a distinct audible rush of air that made Calloway's shoulders drop about an inch. The saturation number on the monitor stopped falling, hung at 86 for 4 seconds, then moved to 88. "That's decompression," Evelyn said. "That's not a fix. He needs the tube revised, and he needs it now, because I've bought us maybe 15 minutes, and the underlying problem is still there." Wells' eyes had opened at some point during the last 40 seconds. He was looking at the ceiling. His lips moved. Evelyn leaned in. "Don't talk." He said it anyway. It came out as 3 words, barely voiced, but she was close enough to hear them. "The case," he said. "Check the case." The surgical team took well at 09:44. Evelyn scrubbed out of the room and stood in the corridor with her back against the wall and her hands, for the first time in about 18 hours, visibly unsteady. Logan found her there 90 seconds later. "He's alive," she said before he asked. "Retained hemothorax with a clotted tube. It's a known complication. It happens." "But?" Evelyn looked at him. "But," she said, "the chest tube was placed by the surgical team at 23:50 last night, and it was functioning correctly at the 0600 check, and at 0800 the nursing note says output was within expected range, and the tube was patent." She pushed off the wall. "And Ruiz did the 0800 check, and at 0920 he was in tension physiology. That's fast. It's fast. It's not impossible." Her jaw was tight. "That's the problem. Every single element of what just happened is something that occurs naturally in post-thoracotomy patients. Which means if somebody wanted a man in that bed to deteriorate without leaving a signature, that is exactly the mechanism they would choose, and there would be no way to distinguish it from bad luck." Logan felt the corridor tilt slightly. Who had access to that room between 0800 and 0920? "I don't know. That's a badge log question. And the badge log is administrative, and administrative reports to..." She stopped. "Voss," Logan said. "Yes." They stood there for a moment. Down the corridor, a cart rattled past. Somewhere a phone rang twice and stopped. "He said check the case," Evelyn said. Logan straightened. "The document case." "Marcus doesn't waste words, especially not at 86% saturation." She was already moving. "He was telling me the file is the exposure, not him. Him deteriorating is a delay. The file disappearing is the win." Logan fell in beside her. Callahan told me not to take custody of it. I'm not going to take custody of it. I'm going to establish whether it exists. Evelyn hit the stairwell door with her shoulder and started up. Because if it doesn't, then everything I have is a summary index with no source documentation, and a summary index is worth exactly nothing in a proceeding. They reached the second floor at EO 958. Voss's office door was closed. His administrative assistant, a staff sergeant named Ottoline Braddock, who had worked at Iron Vale for 11 years and had a reputation for being the person who actually knew where everything was, looked up from her desk with an expression that suggested she had been expecting somebody, though not necessarily them. "He's not here," Braddock said. Evelyn stopped. "Where is he?" "He left the building at 09:15. Braddock's voice was carefully neutral in a way that was, itself, a piece of information. "Vehicle from the motor pool. He didn't file a destination." Logan's stomach went cold. 09:15. 5 minutes before Wells' pressure started dropping. "Sergeant," Evelyn said, "there was a document case brought into this office last night by a general officer. Hard shell, black, foam-cut interior. Do you know where it is?" Braddock looked at her for a long moment. 11 years of institutional survival instinct visibly wrestled with something else, and something else won. "It was in the office safe when I came in at 0600, she said. "I saw it because he had the safe open and he was reading." "And now?" Braddock stood up. She walked to the office door, unlocked it with her own key, and pushed it open. The safe in the corner was closed. She crossed to it, entered a code, and pulled the handle. The document case was there. Evelyn's shoulders came down about a half-inch. Then Braddock lifted it, and the way it moved in her hand, the lightness, the absence of any shift of weight inside, made all three of them stop at once. Braddock set it on the desk. She flipped the latches. The foam interior was cut in precise rectangles for a bound document approximately 2 inches thick. The cutout was empty. For about 4 seconds, nobody in the room said anything. Then Logan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Major Iris Callahan, DISO. He answered. "Pierce." Callahan's voice came through fast and clipped. "Captain, my team is 40 minutes out from your installation. I need you to confirm something for me immediately." A pause, papers moving. "I pulled the reclassification authorization signature block on Hart's personnel file 10 minutes ago. There are 3 signatures on it, exactly as your source indicated." Logan looked at the empty foam cutout. "Go ahead," he said. "The first is a retired officer, deceased in 2019. The second is currently the deputy director at Regional Medical Command." Callahan's voice tightened. "The third signature isn't Harlan Voss." Logan went absolutely still. "Say again." "The third signature is not Voss," Callahan said. "Voss's name doesn't appear anywhere in that document. The third signature belongs to the officer who has been carrying that file for the last 6 months, fighting Regional Medical Command to unseal it." A beat. "Captain, the third signature is Marcus Well." Logan didn't say anything for 4 seconds. I was aware of the empty foam cutout on the desk, of Braddock standing very still, with her hand still on the case lid, of Evelyn 6 feet away watching his face and reading it faster than he could control it. "Repeat that," he said into the phone. "Marcus Well," Callahan said. "Signature Block 3, dated 15 years ago, filed under a unit commander's administrative authority. I'm looking at a scanned reproduction of the authorization page right now, and his name is on it in his own hand. He's the one who brought the file here." "I'm aware of the contradiction, Captain. I'd rather resolve it in person." A rustle of movement. 35 minutes. "Do not discuss this with anyone outside the room you're in. Where's Well now?" "Operating room. He decompensated an hour ago." Callahan's silence had a texture. "That's convenient." "That's what we thought." "Then keep somebody outside that OR door who doesn't work for your installation commander." The line clicked off. Logan lowered the phone. Evelyn hadn't moved. Braddock had gone the specific shade of pale that comes from realizing you've just put your entire career into a conversation you can't unhear. "Sergeant," Logan said, "I need the badge log for the East Wing corridor, 0700 to 0930, and I need the motor pool checkout record for Colonel Voss's vehicle." Braddock's throat moved. "Sir, both of those go through this office. I know. That's why I'm asking you." She looked at the empty case, then at Evelyn. Then she said, Give me 10 minutes, and went back to her desk and started typing. Logan turned. Evelyn was still standing where she'd been. Say it, he said. Say what? Whatever you've been holding since I put the phone down. Evelyn's jaw worked once. When she spoke, her voice was extremely level, which he had learned in the last 12 hours was the sound she made when something had landed hard. Marcus Well was the unit administrative commander for the last 2 years of the program, she said. Every document that came out of that unit had his signature on it. Requisitions, casualty summaries, transport authorizations, hundreds of them. If somebody wanted to bury a reclassification order inside a stack of routine paperwork, his desk is exactly where they'd put it. You think he signed it without reading it? I think that's one possibility. What's the other? Evelyn looked at the empty foam cutout for a long moment. The other, she said, is that he read it, signed it, and has spent 6 months carrying it around trying to unseal something he sealed himself, which is either the behavior of a man trying to fix a mistake. She stopped. Or the behavior of a man trying to control what version of it surfaces. Logan said carefully, he took a round in the chest to get here. Yes. Evelyn's expression didn't soften. And I have known men who would take a round in the chest to be the one holding the story when it came out. Braddock's 10 minutes took 7. She came into the office with 2 printouts and the specific rigid posture of someone who had decided which side of a line she was standing on and was now committed to it whether or not it was survivable. Motor pool first, she said. Colonel Voss checked out a vehicle at 0912. Destination field is blank, which is technically permissible for command staff but not standard. Mileage on return will show at the gate log when he comes back in. And the badge log? She laid the second sheet on the desk. East Wing Corridor, 07 Osurs to 0930. 22 badge events. 19 are staff you'd expect. Nursing, phlebotomy, respiratory, food service. Her finger moved down. 3 that aren't. Logan leaned over the sheet. Evelyn came in beside him. 34, Braddock said. Badge issued yesterday afternoon to a civilian visitor. Records compliance. Name on the badge is Devlin Marsh, credentialed through Regional Medical Command. Evelyn's head came up. Yesterday afternoon. 16:10. 20 minutes before I got the suspension memo. Braddock nodded slowly. He came in ahead of it. Logan's finger moved to the next line. 0847 and 906. Same badge. He went in, came out, went back in. He was in the East Wing corridor for 32 minutes total, Braddock said. That corridor has 4 patient rooms and a supply alcove. Room 4 is on that corridor, Evelyn said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Evelyn said, I want to be very precise about something because if this ends up in front of an investigating officer, imprecision will kill it. She straightened. A badge log establishes that a man was in a corridor. It does not establish that he entered a room, and it certainly does not establish that he did anything to a chest tube. There is a natural mechanism for what happened to Marcus. Retained hemothorax with clot occlusion at the fenestration is a documented complication, and it occurs in patients nobody is trying to kill. You don't believe it was natural. What I believe isn't evidence, she looked at him. But I'll tell you what would be. The tube itself. It came out in the OR, and it's either in a specimen bag or it's in a biohazard bin. And if there's a clot at the fenestration, then the clot's morphology and location will tell a pathologist something. And if the tube was manipulated externally, kinked, clamped, and released, there may be deformation of the wall. Logan straightened. How long do we have? Biohazard collection on the surgical floor runs at noon. He was already moving. He got there at 10:31, and it had already been collected. The surgical floor's biohazard run had been moved up that morning. A scheduling change entered into the facility system at 0752 by a user account that the housekeeping supervisor, a woman named Perpetua Rhodes, who had run environmental services at Ironvale for 9 years and did not appreciate her schedule being altered without a phone call, described to Logan as administrative, which is a whole category and not a person. When does the collection cart leave the building? Logan asked. 11:15. Goes to the compaction bay behind the maintenance annex. Then a contractor picks it up at 1400. Where's the cart now? Rhodes looked at him for a second, then at the corridor, then back. You want me to tell you the cart's in the annex loading area and there's nobody on it until 11? Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I want. Then that's where it is. She turned to go, then stopped. Whatever this is, I moved a schedule for somebody once, 12 years ago, because a man in a nice uniform asked me nice. I don't do that anymore. Logan reached the annex at 10:38, and Evelyn was already there, gloved to the elbow, working through a red bin with the unhurried, methodical focus of someone who had spent a professional lifetime not being squeamish about anything. The OR log lists specimen disposition, she said without looking up. Chest tube, 28 French, discarded, which means it went into general surgical waste and not pathology, which means it's in one of these 4 bins and not in a lab. She pulled a coil of clear tubing out and held it to the light. Is that it? No, that's IV extension set. She dropped it back. 28 French is thicker than your thumb. You'll know it when you see it. Logan pulled gloves from the wall dispenser and started on the second bin. They worked in silence for 4 minutes. For what it's worth, Evelyn said eventually, you don't strike me as a man who does this often. Does what? Sorts through medical waste at 10 in the morning on a hypothesis. I don't. He pulled a suction canister out, set it aside. I have a very structured job. I plan for 11 hours and act for 4 seconds. This is, he made a gesture with a gloved hand, the opposite of that. Does it bother you? Yes. He kept working. But I'm doing it anyway, which I understand is roughly how everyone else's job works all the time. Evelyn made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then her hand stopped. She lifted out a length of thick, ridged tubing with a beveled end and a series of drainage fenestrations near the tip, still bloodied, sealed at one end where it had been clamped for removal. That's it, she said. Logan came around the bin. Evelyn turned the tube slowly in the light, and her expression changed by a degree that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent the last 12 hours learning to read it. There's a clot, she said, right at the proximal fenestration. That's expected. She rotated it further. But look at the wall here. Logan looked. About 8 centimeters up from the fenestrations, the wall of the tube had a faint but distinct crease, a band of pale deformation running most of the way around the circumference, the kind of mark that plastic takes when it has been compressed hard enough, long enough, to remember it. That's a clamp mark, Evelyn said. Could that happen during removal? Removal clamping happens at the distal end near the drainage system, not 8 centimeters from the tip inside the patient's chest. She held it very still. That mark was made on the segment that was inside his thorax, which means it was applied through the chest wall, externally, hard, and then released. Which does what? Which promotes clot formation at the fenestration and converts a functioning drain into a one-way valve. She looked up at him. Somebody put a hemostat on this man's chest tube through the dressing, held it, and let it go. Logan felt something settle in his stomach that was cold and clean and simple. That's attempted murder, he said. That, Evelyn said, is a piece of plastic in an unsecured biohazard bin, and if we handle it wrong, it's worth nothing. She was already reaching for a specimen bag from the wall rack, which is why we are going to do this exactly correctly. Gloves stay on, bag, seal, label with date, time, location, and both our names. And then it does not leave our physical possession until it goes into the hand of somebody with a federal investigative badge. Major Iris Callahan arrived at Iron Vale's main gate at 10:56 with 3 investigators and a warrant authority that made the gate sergeant call his lieutenant, who called Braddock, who did not call Voss. By 11:20, the Defense Investigative Standards team had taken physical custody of the chest tube, sealed room 4, pulled the badge log server, and placed a hold on the facility's document destruction contract. By 11:40, they had located Devlin Marsh. He was in the visitor cafeteria on the ground floor eating a sandwich, wearing a badge that said records compliance, and he did not run, which Logan, watching from 30 feet away, found more unsettling than if he had. Marsh was in his 40s, unremarkable in every direction, the specific physical presentation of a man whose entire professional value lay in nobody remembering him afterward. Callahan sat down across from him. Logan couldn't hear the conversation. He watched Marsh's face, though, and he watched the exact moment when it changed. Not fear, not anger. Recalculation. The face of a man moving from one prepared position to a second prepared position. Marsh set down the sandwich, said something short, and put his hands flat on the table. Callahan came back 40 minutes later and found Logan and Evelyn in the small East Wing office. He's asking for counsel and immunity in the same sentence, she said, dropping into the spare chair. Which tells you he's not the top of anything. She rubbed her eyes. He confirmed he removed the file from the office safe at 08:12 this morning. Evelyn went still. He had the safe code. He had the safe code, Callahan agreed, provided verbally, this morning, by Colonel Harlan Voss. The room got very quiet. He's not admitting to the chest tube, Callahan continued. He's admitting to document retrieval under what he's characterizing as a lawful compliance directive from Regional Medical Command. He says he was instructed to secure a document that had been improperly removed from a classified holding facility and transported without authorization. Logan said, by Well. By Well. That's the framing. Well stole a sealed file. Marsh recovered it. Callahan's mouth was flat. It's a good framing, actually. It's got the advantage of being partly true. Where's the file now? He says he handed it to a courier at the main gate at 08:40 and doesn't know the courier. That's a lie. It's a lie, Callahan agreed, but it's a survivable lie until we find the courier. And finding a courier is a 3-day problem, and we don't have 3 days because I can promise you that whatever's in that file is currently being reviewed by somebody who is deciding which pages survive. Evelyn spoke for the first time. Then we don't chase the file. Callahan turned. Explain. The file is one copy of a set of after-action reports, but after-action reports don't originate in a file. They originate from the people who wrote them and the people who were in them. Evelyn leaned forward. I know 16 operations. I know the personnel on most of them. Some of them are dead, but not all of them. You're proposing witness reconstruction. I'm proposing that the reason somebody spent 15 years keeping documentation out of the accessible record is that documentation is easier to control than people, and they may have gotten comfortable with that. Evelyn's voice had an edge in it now that Logan had not heard before. There were 4 soldiers extracted from the 7-strand corridor in the last operation on that list. 2 of them are alive. One of them is a battalion sergeant major at an installation 1,100 miles from here. And he has never been asked a single question about what happened that night because officially, nothing happened that night. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Give me his name, she said. Colonel Harlan Voss returned to Ironvale at 13:22. He drove through the main gate, parked in his designated space, and walked into a building that had been quietly reorganized around him while he was gone. Braddock's desk was empty. There were 2 people in the second-floor corridor he did not recognize. His office door was standing open, and there was a woman in a dark jacket photographing the interior of his safe. He stopped in the doorway. Colonel Voss, Callahan said from the chair behind his desk. Major Iris Callahan, Defense Investigative Standards. Please close the door. Voss did not close the door. On whose authority are you in my office? Callahan slid a folded document across the desk. Voss did not pick it up. He read the letterhead from 4 feet away, and something in his shoulders dropped about a 1/4 inch, and Logan, standing against the wall to the left of the doorway, where Voss hadn't looked yet, watched a man's entire professional life change posture in real time. I want counsel, Voss said. You're entitled to counsel. You're not entitled to leave the installation, and you're not entitled to communicate with Regional Medical Command, and you're specifically not entitled to speak with Deputy Director Roland Pike, whose name has come up 9 times in the last 90 minutes. Voss's face did something complicated. I want it on the record, he said, that I did not know. Know what, Colonel? Any of it. His voice had gotten louder, which was the first real crack. I approved a consulting contract. I received a recommendation from RMC, and I approved it. When there was friction, I flagged it, which is procedure, and RMC directed an administrative hold, which is their authority, not mine. I restored her contract within 4 hours of receiving new information. I recommended her for department authority. Everything I have done in this matter has been, you gave your safe code to a civilian contractor this morning, Callahan said. Voss stopped. At approximately 0800, Callahan continued, you provided the combination to your office safe, containing a classified document under your personal custody, to Devlin Marsh. At 0912, you left the installation without filing a destination. At 0920, the man who brought that document into your building went into tension physiology in a room Marsh had badged into 34 minutes earlier. The silence in the office had a physical weight to it. I want counsel, Voss said again, and this time it came out thinner. Noted. Callahan stood. Colonel, before your counsel arrives and this stops being a conversation, I want to say one thing to you, off the record and for absolutely no legal purpose whatsoever. She came around the desk. There are 11 soldiers in this facility right now who came off a convoy last night, she said. 4 of them are alive because of a woman you suspended from her position 18 hours ago. And this morning you stood in a conference room and took credit for correcting the situation you created. Her voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. I have investigated a lot of people who did genuinely evil things. You are not one of them. You are something I find substantially harder to be in a room with, which is a man who never once in his career had to decide anything because he was always able to find out which way the decision was already going. Voss's mouth opened. Sit down, Callahan said. Your counsel is 40 minutes out. Marcus Well came out of his second surgery at 14:15 and was extubated at 16:40. Evelyn was in the room when he opened his eyes. So was Logan, standing at the foot of the bed with his arms folded, and so was one of Callahan's investigators, seated in the corner with a recorder that had been running since 1600. Wells' gaze went around the room and landed on Evelyn. They took it, he said. His voice was ruined. Post-extubation rasp, barely above a whisper. Didn't they? Yes. He closed his eyes briefly. Marsh. You know him. Know of him. He's Pike's cleanup. Wells swallowed with visible effort. Water. Evelyn gave him ice chips instead, which he accepted with the resignation of a man who had known she would. Marcus, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that the answer determines what happens to me in about 6 hours. Ask. Your signature is on the reclassification authorization. Well didn't react. That was the thing Logan noticed. No widening of the eyes, no defensive intake of breath, just a very slow, very tired exhale, like a man who had been waiting a long time for a specific question. Yes, he said. It is. Evelyn's hands were flat on the bed rail. Then say the rest of it, she said. I signed it in the 3rd week of March, 15 years ago, in a packet of 140 documents that came across my desk in a single day, because the unit was disbanding and every requisition, transfer, and records action had to be closed out inside a 2-week window. Wells' eyes stayed on hers. That's an explanation. It's not an excuse. I signed it. I didn't read it. And a man in my position was paid to read it. What did you think you were signing? Records disposition, routine, which is what it was labeled as. He took a breath, and it clearly cost him. I found out 6 years later. I was consulting on an oversight review, and a name came across a screen, and I pulled a thread that I was not supposed to be able to pull, and at the bottom of it was a document with my own signature on it doing something I would never have authorized. 6 years, Evelyn said. Yes. And you didn't tell me? No. Why? Well looked at the ceiling. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier and worse for it. Because I couldn't tell you without telling you that I was the one who did it, he said. And I decided, I made a decision, and it was mine, and it was wrong, that it would be better to fix it first and tell you after. So I could arrive with a solution instead of a confession. His jaw tightened. That was 9 years ago. I have been fixing it for 9 years. And then yesterday I heard that they'd stripped your contract, and I understood that I was never going to arrive with a solution because there was never going to be a version of this where I got to hand you the good ending. Nobody said anything. So I brought the file, Wells said, unsolved, with my name on it, because at some point holding on to it stopped being about protecting you. Evelyn stood there for a long moment with her hands on the rail. Logan, watching, thought, this is the part where a person in a movie forgives him. Evelyn said, that was a coward's decision. Well closed his eyes. Yes. 9 years of my life were shaped by an absence that you could have named at any point. Yes. I want you to survive, Evelyn said. I want that very much, and I have spent 2 surgeries making sure of it, and I would do it again in the next 4 minutes if I had to. And I do not know if I am ever going to be able to be in a room with you when it isn't clinical. Well nodded, barely, against the pillow. That's fair. It's not fair, Evelyn said. It's just true. She turned and walked out. The reconstruction moved fast after that, because Callahan had the one thing that document suppression is designed to prevent, which was a list of living names. Battalion Sergeant Major Osric Vandermeer took a call at 1510 in a motor pool office 1,100 miles away and listened for 6 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Ma'am, I've been waiting 15 years for somebody to ask me about that night, and I'm going to need you to send somebody who can write fast." His statement, transmitted in preliminary form at 1745, described a nighttime casualty collection in the 7-strand corridor in which 4 wounded personnel were held in a compromised position for 19 hours. It described a medic who performed 2 field thoracostomies in darkness, who managed a crush injury with improvised fasciotomy when evacuation was delayed past the survivable window, and who made a triage decision, his word, that she carried like a stone afterward. It also described something Evelyn had never told anyone at Iron Vale. Of the 4 wounded, 1 had not survived. A 23-year-old specialist named Idris Kovac, who had been the second priority patient in a 2-patient decision, and who had died at 0412 while Evelyn was 7 feet away with both hands inside somebody else's chest. Vandermeer's statement included a specific paragraph on this. Logan read it at 1820 in the conference room Callahan's team had taken over on the 2nd floor, and when he finished, he sat very still for a while. "She never mentioned him," he said. Callahan didn't look up from her screen. "Would you?" At 1904, Regional Medical Command informed Iron Vale Defense Medical Center that Deputy Director Roland Pike would be arriving on the installation at 0800 the following morning to conduct what the notification described as a records integrity review and personnel determination. Callahan read the notification twice. "He's coming here," she said. Evelyn, standing at the window, said, "Why would he do that?" "Because he thinks he's ahead." Callahan set the tablet down. "The file's gone. Voss is contained, but Voss is also useless to us as a witness because he genuinely didn't know the substance. Wells' signature is on the authorization, which gives Pike a defendant who isn't him. And Marsh is asking for immunity, which means Marsh will say whatever the strongest party in the room tells him to say." "That's a strong position," Logan said. "It's a very strong position." Callahan looked at Evelyn. "And there's one more thing, which I'd rather tell you now than have you find out at 0800 tomorrow with a room full of people watching your face." Evelyn turned from the window. "Pike's office filed a preliminary determination 3 hours ago," Callahan said. "It's not public yet, but it exists." "Determination of what?" "Of you." Callahan pulled up the document and turned the screen around. "The framing is that the classified service documentation was removed from your accessible personnel record 15 years ago because it contained an unresolved adverse finding. Specifically, a field medical decision resulting in a preventable fatality. And the position they are taking is that the removal was a protective administrative action taken in your favor to prevent an unresolved finding from following you into civilian licensure." Evelyn read it. Logan watched her read it, and he saw the exact line where it landed because her hand came up off the desk and then stopped halfway and went back down. "Kovac," she said. "Kovac. They're saying I was protected." "They're saying you were protected," Callahan agreed, which does 2 things. It reframes 15 years of suppression as institutional mercy. And it puts you on the defensive tomorrow morning in front of every officer at this installation, because the moment that determination is read aloud, you are not a woman whose record was stolen. You are a woman with a dead soldier in her file. The room was very quiet. "How bad is it?" Logan asked. "It's bad," Callahan said. "It's bad because it's not entirely false. There is a dead specialist. She was the medic. And once you put a name and an age in a room, the actual clinical circumstances stop mattering to about 80% of the people listening." Evelyn hadn't moved from the desk. "There's a document," she said. Callahan looked up. "What?" "An adverse finding requires a document. It requires a field medical review signed. If they're claiming an unresolved adverse finding existed 15 years ago, then they have to be able to produce the finding." She straightened. "So they'll produce one." "You think it's fabricated?" "I think there was no review," Evelyn said. "I think there was no review because the operation was in a corridor that did not officially have personnel in it, and you cannot convene a medical review board for an event that didn't happen." Her voice was flat and hard. which means whatever they read out tomorrow morning was written by somebody. And a fabricated document has a fabricator. So, they came at 08:00 exactly, which was the only part of it that went the way Pike expected. Roland Pike was a large man in a good uniform with the specific unhurried physical confidence of somebody who had not been genuinely challenged in a very long time. He came into the main conference room with 2 aides and a bound document, and he took the front of the room without asking, and the 40-odd people assembled there. General staff, unit commanders, Weston, Calloway, Delia Okonkwo, standing at the back with her arms folded, watched him do it. He opened by expressing regret about the events of the previous 48 hours. He described the confusion around Evelyn Hart's consulting contract as unfortunate. And then, with the smooth, practiced gravity of a man delivering a kindness, he said, "I want to address directly a question that I understand has been raised about the state of Ms. Hart's personnel record, because I think this facility deserves a complete answer, and I think Ms. Hart deserves one as well." He opened the bound document. "In the aftermath of an operation 15 years ago in the 7-Strand corridor," Pike said, "a field medical review was conducted regarding a fatality. Specialist Idris Kovac, age 23. He let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. The review reached a preliminary adverse finding regarding triage sequencing. It was never adjudicated because the operational context did not permit formal proceedings. In light of that, the decision was made to remove the classified service documentation from Ms. Hart's accessible record, not to punish her, but to ensure that an unadjudicated finding could not follow her for the rest of her professional life." The room had gone completely silent. "I understand that this has been characterized as suppression," Pike said. "I would characterize it as protection. And I regret that the circumstances of the last 2 days have forced it into the open in a manner that serves no one, least of all Ms. Hart herself." He turned a page. "The review document is here. I am prepared to enter it into the record." Callahan from the second row said, "Enter it." Pike smiled slightly. "Major, I'd caution—" "Enter it," Callahan said, "in full, including the signature page." Pike held her gaze for a moment. Then, because there were 40 people watching and because refusing would have cost him more than complying, he set the document on the table and turned it to the final page and slid it toward her. Evelyn stood up. She had been sitting in the third row, in civilian scrubs, and she had not spoken since the meeting began. She walked forward now, and the room turned to watch her, and Pike's expression composed itself into something patient and sympathetic. "May I see it?" she said. "Of course." She picked up the document. She read the finding first, all of it, top to bottom, and her face gave nothing away. Then she turns to the signature page, and she stopped. Logan, 6 feet behind her, saw her shoulders change. Not a flinch, something smaller and much worse. A stillness that went all the way down. "This isn't a review board signature," she said. Pike said, "It's the attending reviewing officer." "There was no attending reviewing officer. There was no board." Evelyn's voice was very quiet, and it carried to every corner of the room. "But somebody wrote this, and somebody signed it." She lifted the page. "I know this handwriting," she said. And she turned slowly and looked directly at Colonel Dara Weston. Dara Weston did not move. She was in the 4th row, 3 seats in from the aisle, and she had been sitting with her hands folded on her knee for the entire 12 minutes Pike had been talking. She was still sitting that way. But every person in that room was now looking at her, and the quality of her stillness had changed from listening into something closer to bracing. Pike recovered fast. "Ms. Hart, I don't think it's productive to—" "Colonel Weston," Evelyn said, and she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't turn back toward Pike at all. "Did you write this?" The room waited. Weston's throat moved once. "Yes," she said. Somebody in the back row said something under their breath. Delia Okonkwo's arms came down off her chest. Pike said quickly, "Colonel Weston was an assigned medical review officer at the time, and—" "I was a captain," Weston said. Pike stopped. "I was a captain," she repeated louder, and she stood up, and she did it badly. She caught her hip on the chair arm, and the chair scraped and she didn't correct it. "I was 29 years old, and I had been at Regional Medical Command for 11 months, and I was not an assigned medical review officer, because there was no review. There was no board. There were no proceedings. There was a request from a colonel's office for a summary assessment of a triage sequence in an operation I had no clinical involvement with, and no access to primary documentation for. And I wrote it, and I signed it, and I have known for 15 years exactly what it was. The conference room had stopped being a room where a briefing was happening. Pike said, "Colonel, I'd advise you to shut up," Weston said. It came out of her like something that had been pressurized for a very long time, and it landed with the specific ugliness of a person finally saying a thing they had rehearsed alone and had never expected to actually say. Her face was red. Her voice was not steady. It was, Logan thought, the least composed thing he had ever seen a senior officer do in public. And it was also the first entirely honest thing that had happened in that room all morning. Callahan stood up. "Colonel Weston, before you go further, you have a right to counsel, and anything you say here is on a recorded proceeding. I know what I'm doing. I want it stated that you were advised. You advised me." Weston came out of the row into the aisle. She looked at Evelyn, and then she looked away from Evelyn because she couldn't hold it. "I need to say the rest of it while I still—" She stopped. Reset. "The request came to my office on a Thursday. It came with a note. The note said the assessment was needed for administrative closure of a personnel action and that the operation was in a compartment I was not read into, so I should base the assessment on the summary provided." "Who sent it?" Callahan asked. "Colonel Roland Pike." Pike's aides had gone very still on either side of him. Pike himself had not moved, which was, Logan noted with a distant clinical interest, exactly what a man did when he had decided that any movement would look like guilt. "He was a colonel, then," Weston said. "He was 2 grades above me, and he was the person who wrote my evaluations, and the note was 3 sentences long, and it was very clear about what the assessment was supposed to conclude." Her jaw worked. "And I wrote it. It took me 40 minutes. I based a preventable fatality finding against a medic. I had never met on a 2-paragraph summary that did not include the evacuation delay, did not include the number of casualties, did not include the fact that she was operating without light, and did not include that she had a second thoracostomy in progress at the time of the fatality." She swallowed. "It wasn't a review. It was a sentence with a signature on it." Somebody's chair creaked. "I have thought about it every year," Weston said. "That is not an achievement. Thinking about something for 15 years and doing nothing is not an achievement. It's just a longer version of doing nothing." She finally made herself look at Evelyn directly. "When your consulting contract came through this facility, I saw your name and I recognized it immediately, and I did not say anything. And then I sat in a briefing room 2 days ago and watched a captain question your qualifications, and I did not say anything then either." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she kept going anyway. "I told him you'd been in trauma care 30 years. That's what I said, 30 years. I had a document in my history that took 14 of them away from you, and what I said was 30 years. Nobody in the room said anything. Evelyn was still holding the signature page. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you read it out loud," Weston said. 15 years it was a piece of paper in a compartment. 10 minutes ago he stood up in front of my facility and said a dead soldier's name and age out loud to make a point about protecting you. Her hands had started shaking, and she made no attempt to hide it. "And Kovich was 23, and I have never met a single person who was actually there that night, and I named him in a document as evidence of your failure without knowing one thing about him. That's not something I get to sit through twice." What broke Roland Pike was not the confession. Confessions can be managed. A confession from a mid-career officer describing pressure from a superior 15 years ago is a credibility contest, and credibility contests between a deputy director and a colonel with a signed document in her own hand are not, historically, close. What broke Roland Pike was that Dara Weston had kept the note. She said so at 0841, in a smaller room with Callahan and 2 investigators and a recorder, after Pike had been escorted out of the conference room by people who did not work for him, and after the 40 people in that room had been dismissed into corridors where nobody quite knew what to say to each other. "It's in a bank box in Ardenmere," Weston said. "It's been there since the following spring. Original, plus the transmittal envelope, plus my own contemporaneous handwritten note describing the phone call I had with his office 2 days before it arrived." Callahan's pen stopped. "You made a contemporaneous note." "I made a contemporaneous note." Weston laughed, and it was a bad sound. "Because I was 29 and I was scared, and I thought that documenting my own cowardice would somehow be the same thing as not being a coward. It isn't. It's just paperwork." She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. But it exists. And it has his office's phone number and a date and my handwriting, and I have never told a single person about it in 15 years. Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Colonel, she said, I want to be very clear with you about your position, because you deserve to hear it accurately rather than hopefully. What you've done this morning is going to end your career. It is probably going to end it with an adverse characterization. It may not end there. Falsification of a medical assessment is a chargeable offense, and the fact that it was directed doesn't erase it. I know. And the note is going to be the single most important piece of evidence in a proceeding that is going to take about 18 months and will require you to sit in a room and describe what you did approximately 40 times. I know that too. Then why? Weston lowered her hands. Because for 15 years I've been telling myself that I was a good doctor who did one bad thing, she said. And I sat in that conference room this morning and watched a woman read her own name in a document I wrote, and I understood that's backwards. I've been a person who did one bad thing and then spent 15 years being a good doctor to make the arithmetic work. Her voice was flat and worn out. The arithmetic doesn't work. There isn't an amount of correct medicine that adds up to unwriting a sentence about a dead 23-year-old. The Ardenmere box was opened at 14:20 that afternoon by a two-person team with a court order and Weston's written consent. The note was exactly as she had described it. 3 sentences, unsigned but on Pike's office letterhead, transmitted with a routing slip bearing his administrative initials. The contemporaneous memo was in Weston's handwriting on a sheet of hospital notepaper, dated, describing a phone call in which she was told the assessment was for closure, not for adjudication, and that the substance was already understood at the appropriate level. By 17 o'clock, Roland Pike had been relieved of his duties at Regional Medical Command pending a full investigation, his access suspended, and his name attached to a formal referral. By the following Tuesday, the referral had produced 2 things Pike had probably not accounted for. The first was that Devlin Marsh, whose request for immunity had been evaluated by people who now had a considerably better idea of what Marsh was worth, stopped being useful to anybody and started being a defendant. He produced the file. It had never gone to a courier. It had gone into the trunk of his rental vehicle and stayed there for 31 hours because Marsh, whatever else he was, had been in the business long enough to know that destroying something is what you do when you're certain, and he had stopped being certain at approximately the moment federal investigators walked into the visitor cafeteria. The file was intact, all 16 after-action reports. The second thing was Osric Vandermeer. The battalion sergeant major arrived at Iron Vale on a Wednesday morning, 11 days later, in service uniform, having driven 1,100 miles because he did not like flying and did not care who knew it. He gave 4 hours of formal statement. Then he asked whether Evelyn Hart was in the building. They found her in the East Wing. He was a heavy man in his 50s with a bad knee and a face that had gone through several weathers. He stood in the doorway of her office and looked at her for a while without saying anything at all. "Sergeant Major," Evelyn said. "Ma'am." His voice was gravel. "I've been carrying something for you for 15 years, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me set it down." She stood up. "You've been thinking about Kovac," he said. Evelyn didn't answer. "I know you have, because I have." Vandermeer came into the room. "I was the one holding pressure on him. You were 7 feet away with both arms in Rasmussen's chest, and you'd made the call 4 minutes before, and I want you to know exactly what happened in those 4 minutes, because I don't believe anybody's ever told you, and I've had a long time to figure out that they probably didn't." "Sergeant Major." "He was talking," Vandermeer said. "He asked me if you were the one who did the thing with the tube on Halverson at the crossing. I said yes. He said—" Vandermeer stopped, and his jaw went hard, and he pushed through it. He said, "Then she knows what she's doing, so I'm good." And then he went quiet, and about 2 minutes later he was gone, and he was not scared, ma'am. He was not scared, and he was not alone, and he had made his own decision about whether he trusted the person running that casualty collection point. Evelyn's hand had found the edge of the desk. "I'm not telling you that to make it easier," Vandermeer said. "I don't think it's supposed to be easy. I'm telling you because a man wrote a piece of paper that said you failed him, and the actual last thing that soldier said out loud was that he was good because you were there. And I figure the second one ought to outweigh the first one, and it's been 15 years and nobody's ever put them side by side for you." Evelyn stood there for a moment. "Sit down, Sergeant Major," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, and she made no effort to fix it. "You drove 1,100 miles. At least sit down." The consequences landed over the following 4 months, and they landed publicly, which mattered more than anything else about them. Roland Pike was charged with conspiracy to falsify official records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and unlawful direction of a subordinate officer. The proceedings ran through the winter. He did not testify. His defense was that the reclassification had been a legitimate compartmentalization decision made in an operational context that outsiders could not evaluate, which was, Callahan told Logan afterward, a genuinely strong argument right up until the moment the panel was shown a 3-sentence note in his own office's letterhead instructing a 29-year-old captain what conclusion to reach before she had seen any evidence. He was convicted on all 3 counts. He received a sentence, a dishonorable characterization, and the forfeiture of a pension he had spent 31 years accumulating. The verdict was reported. His name was printed. Officers who had trained under him found out about it the way everyone else did. Devlin Marsh pleaded to unlawful removal of classified material and a lesser count related to unauthorized access, and cooperated and received 40 months. The chest tube did not, in the end, produce a chargeable count against him. The pathologist's report established external compression consistent with clamping and could not establish who had applied it, and Callahan, to her visible frustration, made the correct call not to charge something she couldn't prove. "It's the one that gets away," she told Evelyn in a corridor in February. "There's always one. I've stopped pretending there isn't." Colonel Harlan Voss was relieved of command at Iron Vale. His outcome was, in the end, the smallest and the most quietly humiliating. He was not charged with anything. He had not known about the reclassification, had not directed the suspension, and had given a safe combination to a man who arrived with valid RMC credentials and a compliance directive that was on its face legitimate. The investigating panel found that his conduct did not rise to criminality. It found, in language that was read aloud and entered into his permanent record, that he had demonstrated a pattern of deferring institutional judgment to perceived hierarchical momentum rather than exercising independent command assessment, and that this pattern had materially contributed to the removal of a qualified clinician from a critical care role during a period of active operational risk. He was reassigned to a logistics readiness position at a facility in the upper Midwest. He kept his rank. He would retire in 4 years at that rank, from that desk. Logan ran into him once, in the parking area, 3 days before he left. Voss was loading a box into his vehicle. "Captain?" "Sir?" Voss straightened. He looked older than he had in November, in the specific way that men who have never had to absorb a real consequence look after absorbing one. "I want to ask you something," Voss said, "and I'd like a real answer because I'm not going to get many more of those." "All right." "In the briefing room, when you challenged her," Voss's eyes were tired, "you were wrong, and you owned it, and you called an investigative office at 4 a.m. on an inference that could have ended you." He shifted the box. "I've been trying to work out why you did that, and I didn't." Logan considered it for a moment. "Because I'd already said the wrong thing out loud in front of 40 people, he said. "So there wasn't a version left where I got to be quiet and still be a person I recognized." Voss nodded slowly. "That's the part I never had," he said. Evelyn Hart's classified service record was restored to her accessible personnel file in March. The restoration was not a ceremony. It was an email, then a packet, then a formal notation, and the whole thing took about 6 weeks of administrative process that she was mostly not involved in. When the packet finally arrived, she read it in her office with the door closed, and it took her 2 hours, and she came out afterward and went straight to a shift change briefing and said nothing to anyone about it. 14 commendations were reissued under her name. 3 of them were significant. One of them was the kind that gets a citation read aloud. She declined the ceremony twice. The third time, Delia Okonkwo, who by then had made staff sergeant and had developed a working relationship with Evelyn that consisted mostly of Delia telling her things she didn't want to hear, sat down across from her desk and said, "You know this isn't about you, right?" Evelyn looked up. "It's a ceremony with my name on it." "Sure. And there'll be about 90 people in that room, and about 30 of them are going to be young enlisted medics who have never once seen somebody who looks like a nurse get a citation readout." Delia leaned back. "You can hate the whole thing. Hate it standing up front where they can see you." Evelyn was quiet for a while. That's manipulative, she said. Extremely, Delia agreed. Evelyn accepted the fourth time. Well, the ceremony was in April, in the same second-floor conference room, which somebody had made a decision about, and which Evelyn noticed immediately. She stood at the front in a service dress uniform she had not worn in 15 years, and which did not fit correctly across the shoulders anymore. And she listened to a citation describe 19 hours in the Seven-Strand corridor in language so procedural it was almost unrecognizable as the thing that had happened. She kept her hands at her sides. She did not look at the audience for most of it, because Vandermeer was in the second row in his service uniform, and Marcus Well was in the third row in a chair with a cane leaning against it, and looking at either of them would have cost her something she wasn't prepared to spend in front of 90 people. When it was over, they asked her to say something. She hadn't prepared anything. She'd assumed she wouldn't have to, which was, she realized standing there, an extraordinarily naive assumption for a woman of her age. "I'm not good at this," she said. Somebody laughed. "I'm not being modest. I'm telling you that in about 90 seconds I'm going to run out of things to say, and it's going to be uncomfortable, so I'd like to use the time well." She looked out at them. "There are 31 people in this room who work in trauma care. I want to say something specifically to you, and everybody else can listen in." The room settled. 15 years ago, somebody decided that the most efficient way to close an inconvenient file was to remove my service from the record, she said. And it worked. It worked completely. For 15 years, I was, on paper, a nurse with a long employment history, and no particular reason for anybody to listen to me. And I want to be honest with you about what that did, because I think the useful part of this is the part nobody puts in a citation. She paused. "It made me quiet," she said. "Not internally. I've never been quiet internally, but I stopped arguing. I learned that if I said something in a room and the room decided I wasn't qualified to say it, arguing didn't change the outcome. It just cost me energy I needed for the next patient. So I stopped." Her voice was even. And I told myself that was efficiency. It wasn't. It was a wound that I'd gotten so used to that I'd started describing it as a strategy. Nobody moved. 2 days before all of this started, a captain in this facility stood up in a briefing and asked what made me qualified to advise soldiers, Evelyn said. He was wrong, and he was rude, and he was also the only person in 15 years who asked the question out loud instead of just quietly acting on the answer. She let that sit. "That's the part I want you to hear. The thing that finally moved was not somebody being kind to me. It was somebody being wrong loudly enough that the wrongness became visible." She looked down at her hands, then back up. "So here's the actual thing I want to say, and then I'll stop. If you are in a room and you are the person nobody has a category for, if you have skills that don't come with paperwork, or experience that doesn't fit the format, or a background somebody found inconvenient, the temptation is going to be to make yourself smaller so the room is easier to be in. Don't. Not because it's noble to be difficult, because the skill you're carrying belongs to whoever's on the table next, and every year you spend being quiet about it is a year that person doesn't get the benefit." She stepped back from the podium. "And if you're in a room where somebody else is being made small," she said, "you don't need certainty to speak. You just need to be willing to be wrong out loud. That's what it costs. That's the whole price." They offered her the department. The formal title was Director of Combat Trauma Response, which was what Voss had announced in November before any of it fell apart, and which had been sitting in an administrative queue ever since. Regional Medical Command, under an acting deputy director with an entirely different disposition, reissued the offer in May with expanded authority and a budget line. Evelyn turned it down. Callahan found out about it a week later and called her from a car somewhere in Virginia. "Explain that to me." "It's a facility director role," Evelyn said. "I'd be running protocols and staffing and budget at one installation with a good trauma bay and 11 miles of paved road between it and the nearest problem." "That's a serious position." "It's a serious position for somebody else." Evelyn was standing in the East Wing corridor with a coffee she hadn't drunk. "Iris, do you know how many field medics deploy every year with no exposure to austere thoracic management until the first time somebody's actually dying in front of them?" A pause. "No. Neither does anybody, because we don't track it well. But I do know that Calloway is a third-year resident at a good facility with good supervision, and he compared a patient's breath sounds to his expectation instead of to a documented baseline, And that man nearly died on a Tuesday morning in a building with a functioning OR 80 feet away. Evelyn's voice sharpened. That's not Calloway's failure. That's a curriculum failure. Nobody taught him that the specific thing that kills post-thoracotomy patients is comparing to what you assume instead of to what you wrote down. Callahan said slowly, "You want to build a course. I want to build a program, mobile. Instructors who've actually done it in bad conditions, going to installations instead of waiting for people to rotate through one facility." Evelyn exhaled. There are maybe 40 people alive in this country who can teach austere field trauma from direct experience, and most of them are in their 50s and 60s and nobody has ever asked them, and in 15 years most of them will be dead and the knowledge will just stop. Who funds that? That, Evelyn said, is going to be an 18-month fight with people who like the current organizational chart, and you want to have that fight. I've had worse ones. A pause. And I have a signed citation now, which turns out to be extraordinarily useful for getting meetings with people who wouldn't return a nurse's phone call. Callahan laughed, an actual laugh, unguarded, the first one Evelyn had heard from her. "Send me the proposal," she said. "I know 4 people who owe me favors, and 2 of them control budget lines." The 7-strand austere trauma program ran its first cohort 14 months later at a training facility in the high desert, with 22 students and 6 instructors whose combined field experience exceeded 180 years. Marcus Well was not one of the instructors. He had asked. Evelyn had said no, and had said it directly, in a hallway, without softening it. "You'd be good at it," she told him. "That's not the issue." "I know what the issue is." "Then you know it isn't going to change in a year." He'd nodded. "Is it going to change ever?" Evelyn had thought about it honestly, which was the only thing she was capable of giving him. "I don't know," she'd said. "I'm not going to lie to you and say yes so you feel better, and I'm not going to say no just to make it clean. You did something that took 9 years of my life, and you did it out of cowardice dressed up as protection. And you also crossed a threat corridor with a hole in your chest to hand me a file with your own name on it, and I don't know what to do with both of those at once. I'm 56 years old, and I still don't know what to do with both of those at once." Well had leaned on his cane and looked at the floor for a while. "That's more than I expected," he'd said. "It's less than you wanted." "Yes, but it's more than I expected." He went back to oversight consulting. He sent her research citations occasionally, about once a month, without commentary. She read them. She rarely answered. Once, about 8 months in, she'd sent back a single line. "This one's useful, thank you." And he had not tried to build anything on top of it, which she noted, and which mattered more than she said. Logan Pierce was in the 2nd cohort. He was not a medic. He had no business being in an austere field trauma course, and he had to submit a request through his unit commander that came back with a handwritten question mark on it, and he resubmitted it with a 2-paragraph justification about combat lifesaver capability in extended hold scenarios that was true, but was not, strictly speaking, the whole reason. Evelyn saw his name on the roster and did not comment on it. On the 4th day of the cohort, in a simulated casualty collection point in the dark, with degraded lighting and a scenario designed to fail, Logan made a triage call, held it under pressure from 2 instructors who were deliberately arguing with him, and got it wrong. The mannequin died. The scenario ended. The lights came up. He stood there in the sudden brightness with his hands still bloody with simulation fluid and his heart going and the specific hollow feeling of having been certain and having been wrong. Evelyn came over. She looked at the scenario board, then at him. "Talk me through it." "I prioritized the penetrating abdominal over the airway compromise because the abdominal was hemodynamically unstable, and I read the airway as manageable with positioning. And the airway wasn't manageable with positioning, and I didn't reassess it because I'd made the call, and I was executing the call." His jaw was tight. "I was solving the problem I'd already decided I had." "Yes." Evelyn nodded once. "That's exactly what happened. How do I not do that?" "You don't," she said. "Not entirely. Nobody does. The people who tell you they've solved it are lying, or they haven't worked enough volume yet." She handed him a towel. "What you do is you build one specific habit, which is that at fixed intervals you stop and you compare what's in front of you to what you wrote down, not to what you expect. That's it. That's the whole technique. It's not impressive and it's not intuitive, and it will save more lives over your career than anything else you learn in this building. Logan wiped his hands. That's the same thing you said to Calloway, he said, in the corridor, about baselines. Evelyn looked at him with something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. It's the same thing I've been saying for 33 years, Captain, she said. The problem was never that nobody said it. The problem was who was allowed to be listened to when they did. She stood outside the training facility that evening after the cohort had cleared out in the flat orange light of a high desert sunset, with the temperature already dropping the way it did out there. The building behind her had her name on the program masthead and 41 graduates in its first 2 years and a second site approved for the following spring. There was a photograph in the entryway of a young specialist named Idris Kovac, 23 years old, and a plaque beneath it that Vandermeer had insisted on and that Evelyn had, after some argument, allowed. She thought about the briefing room sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. She thought about how close it had come to not happening at all, how the entire sequence had turned on a young officer with a chip on his shoulder being publicly, obnoxiously wrong in a room full of people, and how if he had merely thought it quietly, the way everyone else had for 15 years, she would still be a woman in blue scrubs with no verifiable history, doing good work in a small room, and nobody would ever have known why she was that good. That was the part she had not made peace with and did not expect to. Justice had not arrived because the system had noticed her. It had arrived because a wound got infected loudly enough that somebody had to look at it. But she had also learned something in those 14 months that she hadn't known before, and it was the thing she came back to on evenings like this one. Being underestimated is not a virtue. There is nothing noble about being overlooked, and people who tell you that quiet strength is its own reward have usually never had to eat 15 years of it. The years she lost were lost. Nobody gave them back. The commendations were paper. What she had instead was smaller and better. The specific knowledge that the skill had been real the entire time. Through every year nobody asked. Through the briefing room. Through the memo under the door. It had never once depended on the room's opinion of it. And the day the room finally needed it, it was there. Exactly as sharp as it had always been, because she had kept it sharp for nobody's approval but her own. That was the thing worth carrying, she thought. Not the vindication. The fact that the vindication changed nothing about what she could do. She had been that woman before anyone clapped. She would still be her if they all stopped. Evelyn Hart put her hands in her pockets, watched the last of the light go off the ridgeline, and then went back inside to review the next day's scenario. Because there were 22 students in the morning, and one of them, eventually, was going to be standing in the dark with somebody's life in their hands, and she intended for them to be ready.